Homeless veteran shares, bread with hungry puppy J.D. Vance. Next move will warm your heart. The streets of the city had always been a place where hope could be hard to come by. But for Charles, a homeless veteran struggling to make ends meet, the streets were both a refuge and a prison. Every day he tried to survive with what little he had, fighting his own internal battles while trying to keep his head above water. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him more and more as the years went by. Charles had served in the military, and though he had done his duty, the return to civilian life had been nothing like he expected. The trauma, the loss, the isolation, it all slowly stripped away the man he once was, and the streets became his only constant. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He had fought for his country, but in the end, it seemed that the country hadn't fought for him. It was a thought that often consumed him as he sat on the cold, unforgiving pavement, asking for help, but receiving little more than passing glances. On one particularly cold winter morning, Charles sat in his usual spot by a busy street corner. His military chalce was frayed, and his hands were wrapped around a paper cup that he used to collect spare change. The wind was bitter, and the sound of rushing cars and pedestrians created an indifferent backdrop to his existence. He had learned not to expect much. After all, it wasn't as though anyone had truly cared about his situation in years. As Charles stared down at his half-empty cup, he heard the soft patter of paws and glanced up. A small, shivering puppy trotted toward him, its coat thin and matted. It looked up at Charles with wide, sad eyes, its little body trembling against the cold. The puppy was hungry, just like Charles, and its presence seemed to make the harsh reality of the world around them even more apparent. For a moment, Charles didn't move. He was used to people ignoring him, but the sight of the puppy stirred something inside him. Despite the hardships he had endured, there was a part of him that still longed to care for something, to protect something. It was a feeling he had buried long ago, but in this moment it began to resurface. "Hey there, little guy," Charles muttered, his voice hoarse and weak from lack of food and water. The puppy barked softly, wagging its tail as if it had found a friend. Charles reached down and gently patted its head, his calloused fingers brushing against the soft fur. "You're hungry too, huh?" The puppy nuzzled closer to him, and Charles realized that it had nowhere else to go either. He looked around, but no one seemed to notice the puppy's presence. It was just another stray, just another forgotten soul in a city that had too many. Charles sighed, reaching into the small bag he kept by his side. Inside, he had a piece of bread, something he had been saving for later. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Slowly, he broke the bread into small pieces and offered one to the puppy. The puppy eagerly ate the bread, devouring it in seconds. Charles smiled faintly, though the smile was tinged with sadness. He had given up so much over the years, but at least he could share what little he had left. Just as Charles was about to break off another piece, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, is this your dog?" Charles looked up, surprised to see a young man standing before him. He was well-dressed, his coat immaculate despite the chill in the air. His face was serious but kind, and he didn't seem to mind the cold as he crouched down next to Charles. It was an unexpected encounter. Most people, if they noticed him at all, simply kept walking. But this man had stopped. "No, not mine," Charles replied quietly, his voice rough. "Found him just now. I don't think he's got a home." The young man knelt down and held out a hand to the puppy, who sniffed it cautiously before licking his fingers. "He looks like he's in good hands," the man said with a smile, glancing back at Charles. "I'm J.D. Vance. You may have heard of me. I'm the vice president." Charles blinked, taken aback by the introduction. The vice president? He had heard of J.D. Vance, of course. Who hadn't? But to see him standing here on a street corner talking to a homeless vet was something Charles never expected. "I didn't think people like you noticed people like me," Charles said, his tone laced with cynicism. But, thanks for stopping. J.D. Vance didn't seem offended. He smiled softly, his expression genuine. You'd be surprised what I notice. I've spent enough time in places like this to know that everyone has a story, and no one deserves to be forgotten. Charles's gaze shifted to the ground. He didn't know how to respond. The words felt strange coming from someone who had lived in the world of power and politics. But there was something in J.D.'s eyes that made Charles pause, a sense of sincerity, something that made him want to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time it was different. J.D. leaned closer, speaking in a tone that was almost a whisper. I want to help you, Charles. If you're willing to let me, I can help you get off the streets. I can get you connected with a shelter, and we can start working on getting you the support you need. You don't have to do this alone. Charles's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he wasn't sure he heard right. Help? From someone like J.D. Vance? The idea seemed too good to be true. He had been on the streets long enough to know that promises like these often came from people who didn't follow through. But something about the way J.D. was looking at him made Charles hesitate. Maybe this wasn't just another empty promise. I don't know, Charles muttered, glancing down at the puppy, who was now curling up in his lap, content after the bread. I've been on my own too long. People don't really care about guys like me. I know it's hard to trust, especially after everything you've been through, J.D. said, his voice soft but firm. But I'm not asking you to trust me right away. All I'm offering is a chance to change things. Charles's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He had been let down too many times before. But the puppy at his side and the sincerity in J.D.'s eyes made him wonder if this was a turning point. I'll think about it, Charles said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. J.D. stood up, smiling down at him. Take your time. Charles, when you're ready, I'll be here. I'm going to help you, but you have to be willing to take that first step. With that, J.D. turned and walked away, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. He watched the vice president disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in a long while, Charles felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. The streets were still cold, and the fight for survival hadn't become any easier. But something had shifted within Charles. He wasn't alone anymore, not with the puppy, and certainly not with J.D. Vance's offer of help lingering in the back of his mind. Charles didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years, he felt like he might have a chance to find out. Over the next few days, Charles wrestled with his emotions. The encounter with J.D. Vance had left him with a sense of hesitation and hope. Charles was no stranger to the cold realities of life on the streets. He had built walls around himself, not just to protect himself from the world, but to shield himself from the pain of disappointment. People like him, veterans who had fallen through the cracks, were often overlooked, forgotten. But J.D. had not just noticed him. He had made an offer to help. That alone was enough to make Charles think twice. The streets were as unforgiving as ever, but the weight on Charles's shoulders felt a little lighter now. It wasn't just the puppy Scout curled up beside him, offering a quiet comfort. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, Charles could have a second chance. The idea had been floating in the back of his mind, but Charles didn't know where to start. Even if he accepted help, where would it lead? What would it mean for his pride, for his sense of self-worth? That night, Charles lay on his makeshift bed, the cold air creeping in from the cracks in the shelter's walls. Scout was nestled at his feet, giving him a sense of warmth he hadn't known in a long time. Charles stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly, his mind far from peace. The conversation with J.D. had stirred something deep inside him, but there was fear there too, fear of failure, fear of opening up to someone who might just leave him in the end. As Charles drifted into a fitful sleep, the decision weighed heavily. on his mind. He couldn't stay on the streets forever, could he? The nights were growing colder, and his body was beginning to feel the toll of years spent battling both the elements and the darkness inside him. Scout's presence was a balm to his weary soul, but Charles knew that if he didn't make a change, nothing would ever get better. The following morning, Charles found himself at the familiar street corner again. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just going through the motions of surviving, he was thinking, considering. As he sat with his cup in hand, staring out at the sea of faces that passed him by without a second glance, he saw J.D. Vance again. It was the same as before, only this time J.D. was walking purposefully toward him. Charles's heart skipped. A beat, a mix of nerves and hope rising in his chest. This time he couldn't turn away from the offer. He couldn't let the fear of what might happen stand in the way of something that could change his life. "Hey, Charles," J.D. called out, his voice carrying over the bustle of the street. Charles looked up and saw that J.D. was smiling, but there was a depth to his expression that told Charles this wasn't just a fleeting visit. This was real. "I was hoping we could talk again." Charles stood up slowly, adjusting the Charles set around his shoulders as Scout trotted over to greet J.D. The puppy seemed to recognize him, wagging its tail excitedly. "Hey, buddy," J.D. said, crouching down to pet Scout. "You taking good care of Charles?" Charles smiled faintly, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. He wasn't sure how to begin. How could he explain the weight of everything he had been through? How could he explain the years of pain, the sense of abandonment, the battle within himself that kept him stuck? "I've been thinking about what you said," Charles said after a moment, his voice shaky but determined. "I don't know what it means, but maybe I'm ready to try." J.D. nodded, his expression softening. "I'm glad to hear that, Charles. But you don't have to do it all at once. I'm not here to rush you. I just want to make sure you know you have options. There's a shelter where we can get you set up, and I can help you connect with people who know how to support veterans. Like you. There's no shame in asking for help." Charles swallowed hard. He had been on the streets so long that the idea of asking for help had become a foreign concept. It felt like an admission of failure, like he was giving up the last bit of independence he had left. But deep down, Charles knew the truth. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to live. "I don't know where to start," Charles admitted, his voice quiet, almost embarrassed. "I've been alone for so long, I don't know how to trust anyone anymore." "You don't have to trust me right away," J.D. said with a reassuring smile. "But you do need to trust yourself. You've survived so much already. You have a strength inside you that's stronger than you know. It's just buried under everything you've been through, but we can help you bring that strength back." Charles looked at J.D. for a long moment, then down at Scout, who was now licking his hand. It felt like the universe had dropped this tiny little dog into his life at the exact moment he needed to find something to care for again. Maybe it was time to let someone else help him, to stop carrying the weight alone. "All right," Charles said finally, his voice firmer than before. "I'll do it. I'll give it a shot." J.D. grinned, the warmth in his expression unwavering. "That's all I'm asking. We'll take it one step at a time, Charles. I'll make the calls, and we'll get you settled somewhere safe. You don't have to face this alone anymore." The two of them walked together to the shelter where Charles would stay for the night. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was warm and clean. Two things Charles hadn't experienced in a long time. J.D. stayed with him for a while, making sure Charles was comfortable and introducing him to the counselors who could help him begin his recovery. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And for Charles, that was more than he had hoped for. As the days passed, Charles found himself slowly adjusting to the idea of not being alone anymore. The shelter offered more than just a roof over his head. It provided him with a sense of community, of people who understood the weight he carried. He met other veterans who shared their stories with him, and for the first time, Charles didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like part of something bigger. J.D. kept his promise. He stayed in touch, checking in regularly to see how Charles was doing, and every time they spoke, Charles felt a little more confident, a little more hopeful. He started attending group therapy, and though it was difficult at first, he began to open up about his struggles. The walls he had built up began to crack, and with each conversation, Charles felt a little more like the person he used to be, before everything had fallen apart. It wasn't easy, and Charles knew it wouldn't be a quick fix. But for the first time in years, he could see a path forward, and that was more than he had ever dared to dream. Weeks passed, and Charles slowly but surely began to rebuild his life. The shelter provided stability, but it was the people around him, the other veterans, the counselors, and J.D. Vance, that truly made a difference. It wasn't just the meals or the bed that helped him heal, it was the sense of belonging, of being seen again. For the first time in a long time, Charles didn't feel like he was invisible. J.D. visited him regularly, offering words of encouragement and checking in on his progress. Every time Charles saw him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. J.D. wasn't just offering help, he was offering friendship. He never pushed Charles too hard, but he was always there when Charles needed guidance, reminding him that recovery was a journey, not a race. The mornings were still difficult. There were days when Charles woke up feeling like he was trapped in the past, when memories of war, loss, and loneliness threatened to overwhelm him, but the weight wasn't as heavy anymore. He was learning to talk about his experiences, to share the pain that had once lived silently inside him. The veterans' group meetings became a lifeline, and Charles began to connect with others who understood the complexity of his emotions. There were stories that mirrored his own, stories of battles fought both on the field and in the mind. One evening, as Charles sat with Scout on his lap, he received a call from J.D. It had been a few days since they'd last spoken, and Charles had been busy attending therapy sessions and taking small steps toward regaining his independence. J.D.'s voice came through the phone, warm and familiar. "Charles, how's it going? I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Charles smiled slightly as he heard the concern in J.D.'s voice. "I'm doing all right. It's been a lot, but I'm getting through it. It's still hard sometimes, but I've got some good days too." "I'm proud of you," J.D. said, his voice genuine. "You've made more progress than I think. You realize, and you're not doing it alone." Charles nodded, though J.D. couldn't see it. The words were more comforting than he had expected. He wasn't used to hearing praise, not in this way, not for things that felt so small to him. But J.D. had a way of making Charles feel like his struggles mattered, like his efforts weren't in vain. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about," J.D. continued. "There's an opportunity to speak at an event next week, a rally for veterans. It's being held to raise awareness about mental health resources for veterans, and they're looking for someone who's been through the system, who can speak from experience." Charles's heart raced a little. He had never been one for public speaking, and the idea of sharing his story in front of a crowd was terrifying. But at the same time, he felt a flicker of excitement. For so long, he had kept his story to himself, buried deep within. The thought of sharing it, of speaking out and maybe helping others who had gone through the same struggles, felt like a possibility he hadn't dared to consider before. "I don't know, J.D.," Charles said, his voice uncertain. "That's a big step. I've never done anything like that. I'm not sure I'm ready for it." J.D. paused for a moment, and Charles could almost hear him thinking, "You don't have to be ready for it right away, but I know you have a powerful story, Charles. And I know that if you decide to share it, it could make a difference. People need to hear from someone who's walked the path you've walked. And I'll be there, supporting you every step of the way." Charles closed his eyes and thought about it. The fear was still there, the nagging doubt that he wasn't strong enough, that his story didn't matter. But something inside him had shifted since meeting JD. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming his voice, about finding the courage to step out of the shadows and let others see him, truly see him, for who he was. He had spent so many years running from his own pain. Maybe it was time to face it head on. "I'll do it," Charles said, his voice stronger now. "I'll speak at the rally." "Good," JD replied, his tone filled with warmth. "You've got this, Charles. And when you're ready, I'll be there with you." The days leading up to the rally were a whirlwind. Charles spent time preparing, practicing his speech, and grappling with the emotions that came with revisiting painful memories. It was difficult, and there were moments when he felt like backing out, but the thought of the people he might reach kept him going. Every time he felt overwhelmed, he would look at Scout, who would nuzzle against his leg, offering him comfort and reassurance. Charles wasn't alone anymore. Finally, the day of the rally arrived. Charles stood backstage, his palms sweating, his heart racing in his chest. The venue was large, and the crowd seemed almost overwhelming. He had never been in front of so many people before, let alone with a microphone in his hand. But JD was there, standing just a few feet away, offering a reassuring nod. "You don't have to be perfect, Charles," JD said quietly. "Just speak from the heart." Charles nodded, trying to calm his nerves. He had come this far, and now it was time to take that final step. The announcer called his name, and Charles walked out onto the stage. The crowd fell silent, and for a moment he couldn't see any faces, just a blur of lights. But then he took a deep breath and focused on the words he had written. He started slow, his voice shaky at first, but as he spoke, something shifted. The words began to flow more easily, his story taking shape as he shared his experiences, his time in the military, the struggles of returning home, and the long road to recovery. Charles spoke about the importance of mental health care, of not letting veterans slip through the cracks, of reaching out and asking for help when it seemed impossible. He could feel the audience's attention, the empathy in their eyes, and the connection they were building through his words. And with each sentence, Charles grew stronger. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran who had felt forgotten, every person who had struggled in silence. When Charles finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in years, Charles didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt heard. Backstage, JD was waiting for him with a broad smile, clapping his hands. "You did it, Charles. You were amazing." Charles's eyes welled up with tears, but he fought them back, smiling through the overwhelming emotions. "I don't know how to thank you, JD. You gave me a chance to find my voice again." JD clapped him on the back. "No, Charles. You gave yourself that chance. You did all the hard work. I'm just glad I could be here to support you." As Charles walked off the stage, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He had made it through, and more importantly, he had shared a piece of himself that he thought was lost forever. There was still much work to be done. But now, Charles knew he was on the right path. And with Scout by his side, and JD always there when he needed him, Charles finally felt like he had a future worth fighting for. Over the next few months, Charles continued his journey toward recovery, and it was clear that something had shifted in him. The experience of speaking at the rally had marked a turning point. It wasn't just the applause or the sense of accomplishment that stayed with him. It was the realization that he had something to offer, something that mattered. The support from the shelter, the veterans group, and of course JD had given Charles the foundation to start rebuilding his life. He found a steady job working with a local non-profit that supported veterans, helping others navigate the same challenges he had faced. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving in ways he hadn't thought possible. Scout, his faithful companion, had been his anchor throughout the entire process. The small puppy that Charles had once found on the streets now had a permanent place in his life, offering him unconditional love and a reminder that he wasn't alone. Scout had become more than just a dog. He was a symbol of the new beginning Charles had fought for. Together, they faced each day with a renewed sense of hope. JD continued to stay in touch, always there with advice, encouragement, and the occasional friendly check-in. Charles had never expected to form such a strong bond with someone like JD. He had been wary at first, unsure of what to expect from a politician, but JD had proven time and time again that his compassion went beyond politics. He genuinely cared about people, and it showed in his actions. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was someone who truly wanted to make a difference. One afternoon, Charles sat in the park, Scout lying at his feet. He was waiting for a call back from a potential new apartment, something he had never dreamed of just a year ago. It had taken time. He had had to work through a few setbacks and self-doubt, but he was finally in a position to move out of the shelter and find a place of his own. It wasn't going to be glamorous, but it was a step forward. As he sat there, reflecting on how far he had come, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when he answered, he recognized the voice on the other end. Charles, JD's. Voice was warm, but there was an underlying excitement. I just wanted to check in and let you know that I've been following your progress. You've come a long way. Thanks, JD, Charles replied, a slight smile on his face. I feel like I'm finally starting to get my life back together. I'm really proud of you, JD said, but I wanted to tell you something else. The work you've done, your story, it's inspiring, and I think it's time to take it a step further. I've been talking with some folks, and we're looking at creating a veterans outreach initiative in the community. I want you to be a part of it. Charles's heart skipped a beat, a part of something bigger, something that could help more veterans. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. I don't know, JD, Charles said, hesitation creeping into his voice. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. It's a big commitment. JD chuckled, the sound light and reassuring. I get it. It's a big step. But I believe in you. You've got the experience, the heart, and the drive to make a real impact. And I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you were ready. Charles was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. This was the kind of opportunity he had once only dreamed of. An opportunity to give back, to help others the way he had been helped. But it was also a chance to step into a role that would require a new level of responsibility. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but a part of him knew that it was exactly what he needed. I'll do it, Charles said finally, his voice steady. I'll be a part of it. That's what I like to hear, JD replied, his tone full of encouragement. We'll take it slow, and we'll make sure you have all the support you need, but I'm excited to see where this goes. After hanging up, Charles sat back on the park bench, a sense of peace settling over him. This was it, his chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who had been where he was. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer afraid of the unknown. He had learned to trust again, to trust in the process and in the people who cared. And most importantly, he had learned to trust himself. In the weeks that followed, Charles's life continued to evolve. He moved into a small but comfortable apartment, the first space that truly felt like his own. He spent time learning about the new initiative and how he could contribute, feeling both the weight and the excitement of the opportunity. His work with the non-profit grew, and he found himself interacting with more veterans, listening to their stories and offering advice when he could. The Veterans Outreach Initiative was a success, and Charles played a crucial role in helping to shape its direction. It became a space where veterans could come together, share their struggles, and find resources that could help them rebuild their lives. Charles's own journey had given him the insight to connect with others on a level that few could. His story of survival, healing, and hope became a beacon for those who were still struggling, and he found great fulfillment in being able to offer that light. In the evenings, Charles would sit on his small balcony, Scout curled up beside him, and look out at the city. He had come so far from the man who had once wandered the streets, a man filled with anger, shame, and fear. Now he was a man who had found his purpose, someone who had overcome his own demons and was helping others do the same. Charles knew the road ahead would never be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he looked down at Scout, his faithful companion, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life he was building. He had found his voice, and he was no longer invisible. He was Charles, the veteran, the advocate, and the man who had learned to believe in hope again, and with that he knew that whatever came next, he was ready.